All right, now that we've talked about motivations and different types of homicides, let's talk about what the court process looks like. So what happens when we're investigating and trying to solve a homicide? If you recall, we often talk about clearance rates for crimes, and a crime is considered cleared by the police when it's solved. So this means an arrest has been made. So we basically talk about clearing by arrest. We also talk about clearing cases by what's called exceptional means. In order to clear something by exceptional means, it has to meet 4 criteria. You have to have identified an offender, have sufficient probable cause to justify prosecuting that offender. You must know the location of the offender, and then have something that prevents you from actually making the arrest. So the offender has fled the jurisdiction or has died, perhaps. In the U.S., blacks have the highest rates of homicide clearance, with Latinos having the lowest. Victims over 65 have a lower clearance than victims who are younger. Offenses that are concomitant, so they're committed along with another type of offense, have a lower clearance. When the offender is a family member, that increases clearance. The more physical evidence there is, obviously sort of increases clearance, as does a lower caseload. So when the police have less cases to deal with, it's easier to clear crimes. So the percentage of homicides that are cleared has been dropping over time. So the murder rate has dropped, but so has the clearance rate. And it's been dropping since 1976. So it was 79%, almost 80% of cases in 1976, and was 63, about 2/3 in 2004. Australia has far fewer homicides than we have here in the U.S., but they maintain a stable clearance rate of nearly 90%. Canada has far fewer homicides than in the U.S., but has also been experiencing a decrease in solve rates. So why do we think this is happening? Well, one of the things we have to look at is, has the nature of homicide also changed? So changes in clearance rates likely reflect changes in homicides. So cases in which a murder is committed in conjunction with another crime, or cases in which the offender is a stranger, those are cases that are less likely to be solved to begin with. So if those types of offenses are increasing, we would see a decrease in the clearance rate. Also, if we see decreases in the number of homicides that are easy to solve, so things like intimate partner homicide, because we clearly know who the offender is, that would also decrease the clearance rate. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the police are not doing as good of a job. It just means that the nature of homicide may have changed, and if it has changed in favor of cases that are difficult to clear. So some cases are pretty easy to solve, and what happens early on in the investigation can make or break a case. So as time passes, the likelihood of solving any offense, but certainly murder, is going to decrease. Our memories are more accurate early on. It's easier to locate witnesses early on. So what is really important is that the responding officer is careful and both works fast and follows proper procedures. So the initial response is very important, and a responding officer has 3 major responsibilities. First, we want to determine if the victim is alive or dead. If the victim is alive, we're obviously going to respond differently. If the offender is present, we want to arrest them and notify appropriate people to apprehend someone if an arrest is not immediately made. And then we also want to make sure we've preserved the crime scene and detained any witnesses or suspects. Responding officers should make notes on vehicles and people leaving the scene, and take note of any possible secondary crime scenes. Initially, too, officers want to make sure they're assessing any danger. So safety of both any victims or witnesses that may be there and the officer's safety is of paramount importance. So when responding, you want to make sure you call for any backup, supervisors, or other agencies that may be necessary. When the medical personnel arrive, you want to inform them of any potential evidence and do your best to have them not destroy it. If there are critically ill victims, so victims who are alive but are critically ill and could potentially die, you want to get what's called a dying declaration. So a dying declaration is when someone says something when they think that they're going to die, and then that's considered admissible in court as an exception to the hearsay rule. Any agencies or medical personnel that show up, you want to make sure you're getting their information as well as where they're transporting victims to. You want to document steps taken at each stage and any movement of people or items. Anybody who has arrived at the scene, both investigative and medical personnel, may need to provide fingerprints or DNA in order to eliminate their presence at the crime scene. And if possible, an officer should ride with the victim to the hospital to record any statements that are made. Remember to preserve boundaries of the crime scene, and this is where the crime occurred and where the victim was discovered, as well as any possible entry and exit paths. You want to mark it with a physical boundary, so either walls or crime scene tape, and it's always best to secure a wider area than necessary. You also want to think about anything that could potentially contaminate your scene and take any precautions. So for instance, if you notice that there's sprinklers on the lawn, you want to make sure you can find out if those sprinklers are going on, when they're supposed to go on, and you want to shut them off. You also want to make sure to follow whatever the procedures and laws are regarding search and seizure and obtain consent and warrants whenever required. Then those initial responders are going to hand the scene over to a homicide investigator. When you do so, you want to make sure you have provided all the necessary information to that investigator as well. What are the boundaries of the scene? Who are the witnesses, surviving victims, etc. And you want to document your response ASAP, because again, the sooner we document something, the better our memory is. So what happens when the homicide investigator arrives on the scene and they're going to make a preliminary scene assessment? So they need to think and prioritize what steps need to be taken. So we're going to need staging areas for consultation, equipment, and evidence storage. If there's more than one crime scene, you want to make sure you're establishing communication between each of those scenes and ensure that search warrants are obtained when necessary. So in Katz v. U.S. in 1967, the Supreme Court held that citizens have a reasonable expectation of privacy. So the police cannot just automatically search anywhere it's where a reasonable person would expect to have privacy. What's considered, privacy by a reasonable person does change over time. So generally speaking, whenever you can, you want to get a search warrant. And a search warrant has to be issued by a judge or a magistrate. In order to get one, the officer has to show probable cause that specific illegal activities have been or will be committed. They need to detail out where they're going to search and what they're searching for and what they hope to seize. And they must be very careful in specifying these details and ensuring that the address is correct. You want to provide information that's broad enough to cover what you might find, but specific enough to convince a judge that you're searching for evidence that's likely to exist. Police can conduct warrantless searches, and they can do so in order to preserve evidence or for their own safety. So there's a few ways that this happens. First of all, you can ask somebody permission to search their person or to search their home. And if they consent, then this is, you have received consent to search. You can also conduct a search incident to arrest. So when you have arrested somebody, you are allowed to search them and the area under their immediate control. And you do this for officer safety, to make sure no weapons are present and that the accused cannot destroy evidence. In 1981, the Supreme Court ruled that an entire car is considered the immediate area of the suspect. Without an arrest, the police cannot search a vehicle without a warrant unless they have probable cause to believe the vehicle has evidence of criminal activity. You can enter a building, which is considered, generally you need a warrant to enter premises when we're engaging in hot pursuit. And in Flippo v. West Virginia in 1999, the Supreme Court reiterated a 1977 ruling that said a homicide scene does not, in and of itself, constitute an emergency situation that would allow for a warrantless search. This is part of why we secure a crime scene, so that officers have time to get the necessary warrants in order to search. It's also important when you arrive upon a scene to separate witnesses. We won't want the witnesses talking to each other, because then their recollections will start to affect each other's recollections. You want to be sure to fully document the scene, photograph, sketches, and notes, and be sure to properly collect evidence and ensure the chain of custody. In here, you can just take a moment to look. We have these steps for ensuring chain of custody. You're also probably aware of this information if you took principles of investigation. So, in a murder, the body is going to provide important evidence, and homicide detectives might try to determine an approximate cause and manner of death. So cause of death has two components. There's approximate cause. This is the initial event that led to the death. So if you were shot, it's the actual gunshot wound. And then there's the immediate cause. What, when you're shot, causes you to actually die? And that's loss of blood. Manner of death refers to whether or not it's a natural death, a suicide, an accident, a homicide, or undetermined. The victim's body and science, which is fabulous, can really help us figure out what time somebody died. And this, in turn, is important for narrowing in on suspects and for suspects' alibis. So one type of evidence that we would see at a murder scene, is blood spatter evidence. So as blood drops from the body, it's affected by gravity. This means then that the shape of the droplet can tell us the direction from which the blood was traveling. If it's a round drop, it fell straight down. Any other shape indicates it was not simply dropped. And the tail of the blood drop would tell us the direction from which the blood came. Blood spatter can tell us if a victim is right or left-handed. So when facing a victim, if the blood track is to the victim's right and going away from them, the offender used the right hand to beat them. Several lines of blood indicate more than one strike. Wider blood trails tell the investigator that a knife was an unlikely weapon because knives leave thin tracks, whereas something like a pipe would leave a wider track. So we can use science to help us solve crime. Fingerprints are considered unique to each individual, although we haven't actually rigorously tested this. The most common type of print we see are latent prints. These are where a print is left behind on a surface from the oils in our fingers. So if you were to pick up your phone and look at the screen of your phone, you would probably see many latent prints. A patent print is when you touch a foreign substance like ink or blood and then transfer the imprint of your finger to something else. Molded fingerprints are things we leave in a soft substance, like if you touched wet paint. Scientists have developed ways to lift prints off human skin, but even when we find fingerprints, we still need other prints for comparison. So basically what we do is the police will run prints through AFIS, the Automated Fingerprint Identification System. And this is how Richard Ramirer, the Night Stalker, was caught. Everyone's DNA is also unique, except for identical twins. Identical twins, if you recall, are one egg that's been fertilized and splits early on in the in the pregnancy. Like fingerprints, we also need a comparison sample, and states do have data banks. The federal government has CODIS, and we can use this to solve cold cases. And many states are requiring convicted felons to submit a DNA sample for these data systems, these data banks. In 1889, Alexandre Lacassgne discovered that firearms leave unique markings on bullets. And so today we have the study of ballistics, where we can compare bullets and bullet casings with firearms. The data about this is kept in an ATF database, the National Integrated Ballistics Information Network. So ballistics actually refers to the science of all projectiles. And interior ballistics talks about the movement of the bullet within the firearm, while exterior ballistics occur outside the firearm. It's the study of the bullet in flight. This includes the impact of bullets, what happens to a bullet on impact as well. So ballistics experts can help determine what weapons were used, where they were fired from, where the victim and offender were, and what they were doing at the time of a shooting. So again, yay for science. Other evidence, so we've got evidence from cloth and carpet fibers, tire and shoe prints. We can get information from VICAP, the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. This is a national database established by the FBI to help investigators share information. Investigators voluntarily submit information that allows other people to search VICAP and find similarities across cases and potentially link crimes in one jurisdiction to another. We also have other people involved in solving crimes. So many people will talk about, forensics, and this is the science. This is science as it is applied to the court system. So crime scene investigators, fingerprint analysts, crime scene techs, etc. So when we talk about solving a crime, when we talk about homicide clearance, does the race or class of the victim matter? In 2003, Puckett and Lundum studied all 802 murders in Columbus, Ohio between 1984 and 1992. And what they wanted to see is if extra-legal factors affected homicide clearance. So extra-legal means factors that shouldn't play a role in somebody's arrest or conviction. So things like the seriousness of the offense, that's a legal factor to take into consideration, someone's race or gender or not. They did find that homicides that occur in Black communities are less likely to be solved, but this had more to do with a lack of cooperation. So we found that what they found was that many people were suspicious of the police because of previous interactions and therefore less cooperative with these investigations. In 2004, Litwin found similar results in Chicago, that Latino victims were less likely to be cleared than white victims. And this again may have less to do with law enforcement discretion and more to do with the availability of useful witnesses. So witness testimony can be very powerful direct evidence. Many times whenever we have an eyewitness, people just sort of assume that whatever the eyewitness has to say is accurate. Some detectives have required, encouraged, or volunteer to use standard interview guides. So one thing we can do is develop kits, basically develop sketches, offender sketches, to identify a suspect. This can be done by an artist. It can be done using an identikit or using computer graphic kits. An interrogation is different from an interview. Those being interrogated have reasons to be deceptive. And when we interrogate someone, we have to advise them of their Miranda rights prior to interrogation. You may be asked also to take a polygraph. Even though polygraphs are not admissible in court, they are used as an investigative tool. What a polygraph does is it doesn't actually detect lying. It measures changes in your physiological functions. So it measures your breathing, your blood pressure, your heart rate, and your perspiration. They're accurate anywhere between 64% and 98% of the time. One study found 75% of people who were innocent were found to be deceptive. So again, it's because if your breathing or your blood pressure or your heart rate raises because you're nervous or anxious, that's going to measure. It's not really measuring whether or not you lie. Also, people are capable of passing a polygraph even when they are lying. There's also this thing called a voice stress analyzer, which is supposed to measure tiny differences in a person's voice. It's about half the cost of a polygraph, but it doesn't really produce accurate results. Investigators might also use profiling, and this can be both psychological or sociological. And this includes victimology, information about the type of victims chosen, where and how they were discovered, and where the victims are believed to have met up with the offender. So if a homicide scene reflects an offender's background, it could be used to profile them. So we have both expressive and instrumental offenders. Expressive offenders, the expression of anger can be seen in the offense. We might see multiple wounds to a victim's face, violence that isn't necessary to accomplish the murder, but is done out of anger or to punish the victim. These are often committed by someone with a current or prior intimate relationship with the offender. Instrumental offenders are trying to gain something. They're more likely to be unemployed and have a prior record for theft or burglary, and more likely to have convictions for violent offenses. It's important to remember, though, that profiling is not a perfect science. Many police departments also have cold case squads, and the first one started in 1979 in Metro-Dade PD in Miami, where they created what they called a pending case squad. This squad worked on uncleared cases. In 1983, it was resurrected as the cold case squad. Advances in criminalistics have led to more cold case squads, and their success really depends on the selection of effective supervisors and investigators. San Antonio has used their squad very successfully to solve over 20 cold cases. Wrong way. And that wraps up the chapter on solving homicides.